Chapter 1. The Glove at the Garden Party. It was a gentle June afternoon in the village of Elmswood, the kind of day that made one believe summer might linger a little longer than expected. The air was warm but not stifling. The roses were in peak bloom, and the church bells, though faint in the distance, rang with an almost metronomic precision. The occasion was Miss Lavinia Coombs's annual rose garden party, hosted at Lower Headley Grange, a charming ivy-covered manor on the edge of the village green. It had become something of an institution in Elmswood. One was not truly part of the community, many insisted, until one had attended Miss Coombs's garden party and sampled her famed gooseberry cordial. Lavinia herself, a tall woman with steel grey hair and the bearing of a former headmistress, moved through the crowd with teacup in hand, greeting each guest with equal parts civility and calculation. She missed nothing and remembered everything, a trait both admired and feared. Among the guests that afternoon were the Reverend Pritchard and his fussing sister May, Colonel Ashcroft, who had developed a worrying fondness for gin punch, and Marjorie Fleet, the matriarch of the village's most respected family and self-appointed keeper of all local morality. She arrived precisely at 3:30, as always, and immediately began cataloguing who had come in what, and with whom. New faces dotted the gathering as well. Mr. Julian Hargreaves, for instance, had only recently taken up residence at the Limes, a rather sombre Georgian house just past the cricket pitch. He was a solicitor from London, or so he claimed, with prematurely silver hair, elegantly cut suits, and a smile that showed just enough warmth to charm, but not quite enough to trust. Miss Marple, in a pale lilac dress with a wide-brimmed straw hat and a knitting bag by her side, sat beneath the jasmine trellis on the far edge of the lawn. She had already noticed the way Mrs. Lyle's gaze kept darting toward the Ashcroft gin jug, and how Miss Coombs subtly shifted her position whenever Mr. Hargreaves neared her precious red roses. Her needles clicked along dutifully, though the same row of stitches had been repeated twice. The party unfolded with predictable charm, rhubarb tart, polite gossip, sun hats, and the faint wheeze of the gramophone playing outdated waltzes. And then came the glove. It was discovered by young Millicent Gough, the daughter of the village butcher, who had been darting between flower beds with jam-covered fingers. She trotted up to Miss Coombs, her face flushed and triumphant, holding aloft a cream-coloured glove like a captured treasure. "Look what I found," she chirped. It was by the stone thing, the bath for the birdies. Miss Coombs took it with a frown. "Gracious, I haven't worn gloves before 4 o'clock, since the Queen's coronation." The glove was dainty, of fine kid leather, and clearly expensive. But what caught the eye was the unmistakable streak of dark blue ink smeared across the tips of the index and middle fingers. It was not a careless smudge, but rather the sort of stain one might receive from hurriedly refilling a leaking fountain pen. The Reverend Pritchard leaned over. "Curious, who uses ink these days? Ballpoints are all the rage now, are they not?" Mrs. Fleet sniffed. "Slovenly habit ink suggests a lack of discipline, or secrets." The glove passed from hand to hand. Colonel Ashcroft declared it to be French. Mrs. Lyle thought it might be American. Miss Coombs insisted it was certainly not hers. Miss Marple, ever quiet, looked up from her knitting. "Might I see it, dear?" she asked softly. The glove reached her gently worn hands, and she turned it over with the same attentiveness one might give to a flower specimen. She observed the stitching, the barely worn lining, and the particular hue of the ink. Prussian blue. Quite old-fashioned. She'd last seen such a colour in the ledgers of the Elmswood Ladies' Reading Circle, circa 1948. She said nothing of this. Instead, she allowed her eyes to drift across the garden, over the cluster of guests near the lemonade table, past the vicar's sister fussing with napkins, and landing briefly on Mr. Hargreaves, who was laughing rather too charmingly at something, whispered by Mrs. Fleet's daughter-in-law. There, just beneath the man's right thumbnail, was the faintest hint of blue. The party resumed, the glove seemingly forgotten, as conversation shifted to the quality of this year's strawberries. But Miss Marple watched carefully as the glove vanished, quietly removed from where it had been set beside the bird bath. No one seemed to notice. No one except her. The next morning brought the village to a stunned hush. Miss Coombs was found in her study by her maid, seated upright at her writing desk, head bowed, a spilled ink bottle soaking into the blotter, and a half-finished letter clutched in her lifeless hand. The doctor, summoned in haste, declared the death sudden but unsurprising. Perhaps a stroke, possibly heart failure, brought on by age and excitement. But Miss Marple, sipping her morning tea and reading the news in her lace-curtained parlour, thought otherwise, because Miss Coombs had never been a woman to leave a letter unfinished, and certainly not a woman to allow an open ink bottle to sit uncovered on her desk. Moreover, she had always said with great pride, "I haven't worn gloves before 4 in the afternoon since 1953. And yet the glove found at the party had clearly been hers, or had been meant to appear so. A false clue, a careless ink stain, and a solicitor with secrets under his nails. Miss Marple gently placed her cup down, resumed her knitting, and murmured, "Poor Lavinia, so very tidy in life, and yet so messily gone." The affair, it seemed, was just beginning. Chapter 2. The village reacts news travels quickly in any village, but in Elmswood it moved with the speed and precision of a post office sorting clerk during Christmas rush. By mid-morning, everyone, from the postmistress to the milkman, knew that Miss Lavinia Coombs had been found dead in her study. By lunch, speculation had already woven itself into something dangerously close to fiction. The official word from Dr. Penrose was that Miss Coombs had suffered a sudden seizure of the heart. Perhaps from overexertion, he had added, tapping the side of his nose solemnly, though none could recall Miss Coombs ever exerting herself at all. But such clinical language had little place in Elmswood, where drama and theory were the lifeblood of conversation. At Mrs. Ellison's bakery, the morning queue was abuzz. "Well, I always said she pushed herself too hard," said Mrs. Lyle as she ordered her usual half-dozen currant buns. "All that gardening and note-taking and interfering in other people's business, never healthy for a woman past 70. 72, chimed in Peggy Dunn, the vicar's niece. "I checked the church register. She was born in 1889. "I heard she had a secret admirer from the Temperance League," said Elsie Trent with a giggle. "Perhaps he finally declared himself and gave her a fright." "Don't be daft," muttered Mrs. Lyle. "She hadn't looked twice at a man since the Boer War." At the greengrocer's things had taken a darker turn. "It's the glove," insisted Geoffrey Bell, polishing a bruised apple. That was no accident. Blue ink, mind you. A woman's glove, but it weren't hers. I saw it, offered Nora Blount, eyes gleaming. Passed right through my hands. Prussian blue, I said at the time. Very unusual, that. It's a sign, he said, lowering his voice, that someone wanted her gone. It was the kind of whisper that didn't need shouting. By tea-time, a vague, unnamed unease had settled over the village. No one said the word murder out loud, not yet, but it hung in the air like a fog off the moor. Only Miss Marple, sipping a mild Assam at the Bluebird Tea Room, seemed untouched by the hysteria. She sat alone at the window, her knitting untouched in her bag, her eyes half-lidded as though dozing. But those who knew her well understood the truth. She was listening. The tea-room buzzed with quiet chatter. 2 tables over, the vicar's sister May was whispering earnestly with Mrs. Fleet. "It's too neat, if you ask me," May said. "Too sudden. 1 minute she's arranging the roses, and the next she's gone." "Well, there's talk," Mrs. Fleet murmured, "about the letter. Something to the parish council, I think. Complaints about the state of the memorial gardens. You know how Lavinia was. And then there's the new man. Hargreaves, always hanging about the roses. Never says much." "Indeed," said Mrs. Fleet. "I heard he asked after Lavinia's deed papers just last week. Called it a boundary clarification." Pfft. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. Later that evening, after supper, she took a short walk along Church Lane, the soft clack of her shoes muted by the gravel. The moon had risen, casting long silver shadows through the oak branches, and the village had begun its nightly winding down. The click of doors locked, the dimming of windows, the final shuffle of cats returning home. She stopped before Lower Headley Grange, the late Miss Coombs's house. It stood silent now, its windows shuttered, the gate slightly ajar. Miss Marple did not go in. Instead, she stood for several moments near the garden wall, her eyes resting on the bird bath in the centre of the rose garden. In the moonlight, it gleamed faintly, clean, almost too clean. Then her gaze dropped to the soil beneath the hedges. Something glinted. She stepped closer. It was a fountain pen, old, brass-capped, the sort used decades ago, now lightly dusted with earth. She lifted it with a handkerchief, turning it slowly. The nib was stained faintly with Prussian blue. She made no exclamation. Instead, she returned it carefully to its spot and walked on. The next morning brought a surprise. The solicitor, Mr. Julian Hargreaves, had called a gathering, informal, he insisted, in the drawing-room of Lower Headley Grange, and the Ulashi. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. By the following morning, the gentle rhythms of village life in Elmswood were once again humming, though this time with a strain of tension beneath them. The death of Miss Lavinia Coombs, once believed to be a quiet and unfortunate matter of natural decline, had taken on a more curious air. Conversations, once full of neighbourly pleasantries, now brimmed with speculation. At the village post office, Miss Ramsay, the postmistress, whispered across the counter that Lavinia's maid had seen the ink bottle already closed when she'd entered the study. At the hairdresser's, Daisy Lennox claimed her cousin's friend's niece had once worked at the solicitor's firm, where Julian Hargreaves had been employed, only to find herself quietly dismissed after discovering a series of missing trust documents. None of it could be confirmed, of course, but that mattered little. In Elmswood, suspicion was a currency all its own. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took a different approach. She did not rush to confront Mr. Hargreaves, nor did she press the maid or badger the vicar. She simply resumed her usual habits, visiting the butcher in the morning, stopping at the bakery for half a loaf of wholemeal bread, and pausing in the churchyard to remove the occasional weed from beneath the lich gate. But wherever she went, she watched and listened. It was at the vicarage, over an afternoon cup of tepid tea with the Reverend Pritchard, that the first piece of something solid began to form. "I must say, Jane," the Reverend began, peering down at his biscuit, "the whole thing's left me quite rattled. Lavinia and I didn't always agree, particularly about the choir budget, but I never imagined anything untoward. That glove business, though, eerie." Miss Marple nodded. "It was odd, wasn't it? Cream kid. Very fine, not something one wears while working in the garden." She claimed it wasn't hers. "She did," Miss Marple agreed, "and she said something else. That she hadn't worn gloves before 4 in the afternoon since 1953. The vicar blinked. Really? She was quite particular about it. She had little rituals. Tea at 3:15. Gloves only when visiting. Ink pens only for formal correspondence. The Reverend Pritchard frowned. "Well, I suppose that raises the question if the glove was found on her property and wasn't hers. Whose was it?" Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "Indeed. And why did it vanish so quickly?" The answer, she suspected, lay in two places: the vanished glove and the curiously calm Mr. Hargreaves. So it was that Miss Marple decided to pay a call. She arrived at the Limes mid-morning, her hat slightly askew from the breeze, her knitting bag slung casually over one arm. Mr. Hargreaves answered the door himself, dressed rather unusually in a cardigan and without a tie. "Miss Marple," he said with a polite, if tight smile. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I thought," she said sweetly, "that it might be time we got to know each other. Elmswood is such a small village, and it's ever so important to welcome newcomers properly." He hesitated for a fraction of a second too long, then stepped aside. "Of course, please, come in." The front room was sparsely furnished, elegant but impersonal. A modern clock ticked quietly on the mantel. A single photograph sat atop a bureau, an older woman in Edwardian dress. Miss Gertrude Harwood, no doubt. They spoke at first of trivialities, the damp weather, the unreliability of the baker's apprentice, the curious sound the vicarage bell made on Wednesdays. But then Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "I was thinking about Miss Coombes's letter, the one she was writing when she died." "Yes," he said cautiously. "It was about the memorial garden, wasn't it?" He nodded. "She felt the funds were being misused. And you helped her draft it. I merely provided legal phrasing. I'm told she used a ballpoint pen for everything these days," Miss Marple said lightly. Mr. Hargreaves stiffened. She preferred them, yes, though she kept a fountain pen, I believe. "Of course," Miss Marple said gently. "It's just that the ink was quite unusual. Prussian blue, very distinctive." She watched his face carefully. He smiled, but the smile was tight. I suppose she wanted to make a statement. "Oh," said Miss Marple, "I rather think someone else did." There was a pause, long enough for the clock to chime the quarter hour. Then she stood. "Well," she said, "I won't keep you. Thank you for the tea, dear. Do tell me if you ever need tips for laundering ink out of fabric. It can be so troublesome if left too long." He didn't answer. Outside, the wind had picked up. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, thinking. Mr. Hargreaves was clever, controlled, but not quite careful enough. She had seen the faint crease in his collar where he had tugged at it when she mentioned the glove. She had also noticed a book of calligraphy, open, abandoned on the side table, and the scrap of cloth used to blot ink left on the window-sill, half stuffed behind a curtain. She would not move yet, but she had begun to form a theory. That evening, as the village prepared for supper, a new development arrived. Mrs. Fleet, positively glowing with the self-importance of the bearer of scandal, arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. "You'll never believe it," she said, almost breathless. "It's the glove. It's turned up again." "Really?" Miss Marple said calmly. "Yes, left in the poor box at the church. Folded up neatly, right between two baby bonnets. Reverend Pritchard found it himself." "How extraordinary! It's the same glove, Jane. Prussian ink and all. Curious indeed," Miss Marple murmured. But inwardly she felt something click into place. The glove had vanished too quickly. Its reappearance, so public, so deliberate, was not an accident. It was a message. And someone wanted her to know they were watching. Chapter 4. First Suspects. The return of the ink-stained glove caused more of a stir in Elmswood than even the annual Harvest Bake-Off scandal of 1947, when Mrs. Peabody had been accused of purchasing her treacle tart from a bakery in Little Wetherby. By breakfast the next morning, the story had spread from the churchyard to the grocers and beyond, growing in drama with every telling. That it had been placed in the poor box, an unassuming wooden chest tucked behind the font in St. Michael's, was considered by many to be either an extraordinary act of guilt or a pointed act of mockery. Most leaned toward the latter. "It's a message," declared Colonel Ashcroft to anyone who would listen at the Green Lantern pub. "Someone's playing games, and I'll tell you who it is. Hargreaves. Solicitors are always up to something." "At all," countered Miss Lyle crisply from the bar. "It was obviously the maid. That poor girl must have seen something she shouldn't. She's the one who found the body after all, and so the suspicions began." Miss Marple, true to form, took a quieter approach. She stopped by the church early that afternoon, ostensibly to deliver a tin of ginger biscuits to Reverend Pritchard. The Reverend, still rattled by the ongoing drama in his parish, gratefully accepted the offering and poured her a cup of lukewarm tea in the vestry. "She's truly gone, isn't she?" he sighed, glancing toward the stained-glass window. "Lavinia, sharp as a tack, but I confess I'll miss her letters, even the long ones about the hedgerow management." Miss Marple sipped politely, and yet, even in death, she seems to be writing. That glove, appearing so suddenly again, one wonders whether it was meant to be found. The vicar frowned. "Left between two baby bonnets. You think someone planted it?" "I rather think," she replied delicately, "someone wanted to remind us that they're still in the audience, watching the performance unfold. He went pale. "You mean to say there really was foul play?" "I wouldn't wish to say anything at all, not without knowing more. But, Reverend, might I ask something odd?" He nodded. Was Miss Coombs ever known to wear gloves to church? He blinked, then smiled. Never. She thought them vain in a house of God. Always said, better, too, be clean of hand and soul than laced in kid leather. Miss Marple smiled faintly. So, if a cream glove was found in the poor box, it must have arrived posthumously. He nodded. Quite. And, she added, from someone who knew where it would be noticed. The list of potential suspects, at least in the mind of Elmswood, grew by the hour. Mr. Hargreaves remained the favourite among the more dramatic villagers. As the outsider, the man with legal knowledge, and the inheritor of Miss Gertrude, Harwood's estate, he fit the role of mysterious gentleman with secrets rather too well. That his shoes were always perfectly polished, and his front curtains tightly drawn, only added to the mystique. Then there was Annie, Miss Coombs's maid, who had worked for her for nearly 7 years. A quiet girl from the edge of the village, Annie had always seemed loyal, but her silence since the death had begun to draw speculation. "She's hiding something," murmured Mrs. Lyle, as she picked apples in her garden, always slipping about, and I swear I saw her coming out of the solicitor's house at dusk. And finally there was the matter of Cyril Partridge, the groundsman. A broad-shouldered, taciturn man with thick forearms and a perpetually muddy pair of boots, Cyril had tended Miss Coombs's roses for over a decade. He was not particularly bright, but loyal and gruff, and more than once he had been overheard arguing with her over the compost budgets. "He's got a temper," whispered Peggy Dunn at the bakery. "You should have seen him when she cut down his lilacs, but Miss Marple suspected none of them. At least, not quite." She visited Annie first. The girl lived in a small cottage behind the Coombs property, now eerily quiet with its windows shuttered and the rose beds left untended. Annie opened the door with red-rimmed eyes and a face etched with fatigue. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following day dawned with a bright sun and a brittle wind, stirring the hedgerows of Elmswood, and shaking the dead heads from the roses in Miss Coombs's long-abandoned garden. The news of suspects had cooled slightly. Mr. Hargreaves had made himself scarce. Annie was seen less and less, and even the gossips at the grocer's had tired of cycling the same 3 names in different orders. But Miss Marple, seated at her breakfast table with a pot of marmalade and a very plain boiled egg, was thinking of none of them. She was thinking of a desk drawer. It had remained in her mind. Not just the fact that it had been left open, which Annie had found so uncharacteristic, but the contents that had gone unmentioned. A locked drawer unlocked invites attention. But what hadn't Annie seen? And why? At 10:15, she donned her coat and walked briskly through the village toward Lower Headley Grange. She had a small bouquet of wild primrose in one hand, respectful, thoughtful, a perfect excuse to appear at the late Miss Coombs's front door. It was Annie who answered. The girl's eyes still bore the dark shadows of interrupted sleep, but her hair was neatly pinned and her blouse newly pressed. "Miss Marple," she said, surprised but not displeased. "I thought I might leave these," Miss Marple said, lifting the primroses gently. "Just for the table, you know. It does no good for a house to go without flowers, even when it's grieving. Annie hesitated, then opened the door wider. Of course, that's very kind. Inside, the house was unchanged. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall echoed like a heartbeat. Everything was too still, too composed, like a stage. After the curtain has fallen, the audience long departed. I'll just pop them in the drawing-room, shall I? Miss Marple asked. Annie nodded. I'll fetch a vase. Miss Marple crossed the hallway to the study, where the door was slightly ajar. She stepped inside softly. Nothing had been moved. The writing desk stood in its usual place beside the window. On it, a stack of parish notices, a blue ceramic inkwell, and a blotting pad. The overturned ink bottle had been wiped clean, but a dark mark still bled through the corner of the desk pad. A subtle smear of Prussian blue, drying to black. She moved to the drawers. There was one in particular. Second from the right, brass-handled, too shallow for documents but ideal for correspondence. She opened it slowly. Empty, but not entirely. Caught in the far back corner, nearly hidden behind the wood panelling, was the corner of a paper, no more than half an inch showing. She removed a knitting needle from her bag and used it to ease the folded slip into view. A torn sheet, the edges jagged. A small section of a typed letter with a heading in faint blue. Vesting of all associated shares and titles into secondary estate, to be executed under Clause 7C, subsection. Miss Marple frowned. There was no name, no address, no signature, just a fragment, tucked away, forgotten, or perhaps hidden in haste. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket just as Annie returned with a cut-glass vase. "Oh," she said brightly, "you found your way." "I did, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "and thank you for the vase. It's perfect." She took her findings to the only person in the village who would have any idea what Clause 7C might imply. Mr. Albert Cresswell, the retired bank manager. Cresswell lived in a neat, trim bungalow near the vicarage, with windows so clean they gleamed. He greeted Miss Marple with the cheerful curiosity of a man who missed being consulted. "Ah, Jane, always a pleasure. And what mischief brings you today?" She smiled. "Just a little mystery in typescript, Albert." She unfolded the fragment and handed it across. He adjusted his spectacles and read it twice. Legal drafting, quite specific. Vesting of shares into secondary estate. That's inheritance language, Jane. This sort of clause usually comes into play when someone has changed their beneficiary. Would it appear in a standard will? In a more complex one, yes, especially if there were adjustments made to reallocate assets. This phrase, Clause 7, that would suggest it's part of a formal amendment or codicil. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And if it were torn? That would make it rather hard to prove anything, he said, setting the slip down. "Why do you ask?" She smiled faintly. "Just a theory, Albert. Just a theory." By the following morning, she was back at the Limes. This time, Mr. Hargreaves did not greet her at the door. Instead, it was the sound of footsteps and a low curse that signalled his presence. He was in the garden, remarkably unkempt for such a polished man, digging near the hedge with a small trowel. "Miss Marple," he said, standing and brushing dirt from his hands. "You do keep curious hours." "I find them very productive," she said with an even smile, "especially when I'm thinking about documents." His expression flickered. "What sort of documents?" "Oh, estate ones, legal papers, clauses, subsections, that sort of thing." He stiffened. "I really don't think Miss Coombs was altering her will," Miss Marple said calmly. "There was a clause that would have transferred property. Perhaps the limes or something in the bank to a different beneficiary. That clause was removed or destroyed, except it wasn't completely." She reached into her handbag and drew out the folded paper. "I found this in her drawer, slipped between the wood, torn hastily." Hargreaves stared at her. "You shouldn't be rummaging through private property." "I wasn't rummaging," she said. "I was looking for flowers. The drawer offered something else." He looked away. "I wonder," Miss Marple mused aloud, "how quickly someone could stage a death, with ink and timing. Miss Coombs was fastidious. She wouldn't leave a mess. And yet she died with ink spilled and her letter unfinished." He said nothing. "Do you know what I think?" she continued, her voice still light. "I think someone panicked. She'd changed her mind, perhaps, about the trust, about the will. And in that moment someone thought they were losing everything." Hargreaves's jaw clenched. Miss Marple took a step closer. "I'm not accusing you, dear. I'm simply observing how very careless it is to leave a legal fragment behind." She turned. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I must see about a sponge cake for the ladies' auxiliary. Do have a pleasant morning." She left him standing in the garden, trowel in hand, a faint blue smudge at the edge of his right thumb. It was fading now, but she had seen it, and she remembered everything. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets Miss. Marple returned home that afternoon with a great deal on her mind and very little in her shopping basket. Some marmalade, 2 rashers of bacon, and a half-pint of milk. It was just enough to maintain appearances while her thoughts swirled around the tangled edges of Miss Coombs's final days. The fragment of the legal clause had not merely confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion, it had clarified the stakes. Someone had risked a great deal to hide a very particular alteration, an inheritance reallocation, and had done so hastily, sloppily, with ink on the fingers and a half-buried pen near a birdbath. It was not the work of a mastermind, but of someone pushed to act before they were ready. Still, Miss Marple knew better than to act rashly. The truth would come not through confrontation, but through pressure, applied with the gentlest of fingers, and pressure, she thought, was best applied through conversation. The opportunity came the next morning, when she encountered Mrs. Fleet near the post office. Marjorie Fleet was known for 2 things in Elmswood: the power of her opinions and the reach of her voice. "I do hope you're keeping well, Jane," she said, tucking a sealed letter into her handbag. "The village's nerves are quite frayed. I must say, that glove appearing in the poor box, if it weren't so distasteful, I'd say it was almost theatrical." Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, and yet not everyone appreciates the theatre, do they?" Meaning, "Oh, only that I heard. You had words with Miss Coombs about the Jubilee Fund. She was opposed to the redirection." Mrs. Fleet stiffened. "That's hardly the same thing." "No, of course not," Miss Marple said sweetly. Still, she did have a habit of recording such objections in her personal ledger. "Perhaps you've seen it?" "I've no interest in ledgers," Mrs. Fleet snapped. And if you're implying, not at all, dear. I simply thought it might be a shame if someone's name were mentioned in connection with anything unpleasant. In ink, as it were. They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Fleet adjusted her handbag and said, "She did make enemies, Jane. Lavinia wasn't as universally loved as she liked to think." "That's very true," Miss Marple said softly. "And I imagine someone felt her absence would tidy up a great many things." Mrs. Fleet paled ever so slightly. "But if you're so convinced it was murder, why hasn't Inspector Crayford been called?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Because, my dear Marjorie, murder without a weapon or a witness is still merely a tragedy." She left the older woman standing, in a cloud of suspicion, and marched gently on. Later that day, she made her way to the rectory garden, where Reverend Pritchard was attempting to persuade a rosebush to grow against a stone wall that had no intention of cooperating. Miss Marple, seeing his struggle, offered only mild advice. "Talk to it as though it were the parish council. It's the only way to get results." And then turned the subject to more delicate things. "I've been thinking about Miss Coombes's correspondence," she said. "The letter she never finished. Do you suppose she was writing to the council? Or about the council?" The vicar paused. "She often wrote to me first when she was angry. I'd get a long letter. Then she'd send the edited version to the proper address. And did she send anything recently?" Chapter 7. Another twist. 2 days passed in Elmswood with an odd, brittle quiet hanging over the village. The sort of quiet that arrives not after a storm, but in the deceptive lull between one and the next. Mr. Julian Hargreaves was seen only once, leaving the Limes in the early hours with a suitcase and an unreadable expression. Some said he had gone to consult his firm in London. Others claimed he had slipped away entirely. Miss Marple, for her part, said nothing, not to the Reverend, nor to Mrs. Fleet, nor even to Annie, who now lingered about Lower Headley Grange like a cat that wasn't quite sure if it still had a home. But she watched, and it was on the third morning, just as she was adding a fresh coat of polish to the brass doorknob of her cottage, that Sergeant Nash arrived. He looked grave. "Miss Marple," he said with a slight bow, "I wonder if I might trouble you for a few moments?" "Of course, Sergeant," she replied mildly. "Do come in. I've just finished the tea." Inside he took the offered cup, but did not drink. "It's about Mr. Hargreaves," he began. "I gathered," Miss Marple replied. "He's returned to London, but before he left, he stopped at the station and left behind a letter, addressed to Inspector Crayford, sealed. It's in the inspector's hands now. And it wasn't a confession." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "It was an accusation." She set her tea down slowly. "Of whom?" Sergeant Nash hesitated. "Of the maid, Miss Annie Fowler. Now, that was unexpected." Miss Marple folded her hands calmly in her lap, though her mind was already moving with the precision of a pocket watch. "What does the letter claim?" "That Annie had been forging Miss Coombes's correspondence for months," Nash said, "and that she had manipulated the estate papers in a bid to shift the trust into her own hands. According to Hargreaves, she had gained access to Miss Coombes' safe key and attempted to blackmail him into assisting with a new will." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair. "And he's offered proof. He claims there's handwriting samples, that she drafted legal papers under Lavinia's name and kept a journal detailing every step. And has this journal been found? No, Nash admitted. But we've searched the limes, and Hargreaves gave a detailed description of it. Black leather, gold-foiled edges. He said she kept it tucked behind the pantry shelving. Curious place for a criminal to hide a record of their own deception, Miss Marple murmured. Nash nodded. We haven't spoken to Annie yet. We wanted to consult you first, as someone who's known her longer. Miss Marple smiled faintly, and as someone who has a fondness for spotting when the narrative doesn't quite line up. He flushed slightly. That too. Miss Marple did not visit Annie immediately. She took instead a slow walk to the green, where the spring crocuses were just beginning to show. There, seated on a bench by the cricket pavilion, she watched two children chase a hoop across the grass. Their laughter rang clean through the air, genuine, uncomplicated, the opposite of nearly every adult in the vicinity. It was while watching them that she noticed someone else standing quietly at the edge of the field, Mrs. Fleet, not watching the children, watching her. An hour later, Miss Marple knocked at the door of Lower Headley Grange. Annie answered, pale but dry-eyed. I've heard, she said simply. May I come in? Annie stepped aside. Of course. The house was more untidy than before. A teacup on the sideboard, a pair of shoes in the aisle hall, life edging back into a place where death had so recently ruled. They say I forged her name, Annie said bitterly, that I lied to Julian, that I tried to take her money. And did you? Annie looked at her, shocked. No, I loved Miss Coombs. She took me in when no one else would hire me. When I had nothing. She was stern, but she was good. I believe you, Miss Marple said gently. But belief is not proof. Annie nodded slowly. They'll find nothing. Unless, Miss Marple said delicately, someone plants something first. She saw the confusion in Annie's eyes. Real. Honest. And so she knew. The journal was a lie, a planted clue, which meant someone else had turned the game on its head. That evening, Miss Marple visited Reverend Pritchard once more. The vicar, seated by the fire with a threadbare copy of Milton's Paradise Lost, looked up with surprise. More revelations? He asked. Possibly, Miss Marple replied, or perhaps only confirmations. She withdrew a folded sheet from her bag and handed it to him. It was a letter, typed, unsigned, but unmistakable in tone. You always preferred Miss Coombs over the rest of us. She made you feel important, as if your sermons meant something. But you should know, people don't die of ink, they die of fear. She saw too much, and she wrote too much, and I won't be next. He read it twice. Where did you find this? Behind the bell ropes in the chapel. His eyes widened. My word, she was frightened, Miss Marple said, and she had good reason. But she wasn't referring to Julian Hargreaves. You're saying someone else? Someone who knew how to move between spaces, to place objects where they'd be found, and remove others where they'd be missed. Someone with access to the chapel, the study, and the poor box. The vicar sat very still. And someone, Miss Marple added, who is terribly fond of order, and very, very good at tidying up. He swallowed. You don't mean I do. The next morning, Mrs. Fleet's front door was answered by two very polite gentlemen from County Constabulary, accompanied by Sergeant Nash and a warrant. Miss Marple remained at home, quietly preparing a plum cake. But when word reached her that in Mrs. Fleet's sewing cabinet they had discovered a folded black journal, detailing time entries, overheard conversations, and even a draft of Miss Coombs's final letter, she simply said, "Oh, how very tidy of her. The village would never be the same." But then, Elmswood had always been a place where secrets bloomed just as reliably as the roses. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. Elmswood, in the wake of the search at Mrs. Fleet's cottage, was caught in a stunned sort of paralysis. The idea that Marjorie Fleet, pillar of the parish council, master of the bake sale rota, tireless organizer of floral tributes, might have been involved in something so unseemly as forgery, let alone murder, was too much for many to process. 8. The post office. Miss Ramsay fainted outright when the news was whispered through the slot in the partition. At the bakery, Daisy Lennox dropped an entire tray of cherry scones. Even the vicar, unflappable in the face of hymnals gone missing, or bells refusing to chime, was reported to have stuttered during the Sunday sermon. But Miss Marple remained calm. It was not that she took satisfaction in being proven right. It was rather that she had seen it coming, not from arrogance, but from long experience. People showed their truths in small ways, and Marjorie Fleet had always shown hers in how carefully she controlled the narrative around her. Still, Miss Marple knew something wasn't settled. A motive had yet to be named. A confession had yet to be coaxed, and the final act was still waiting to be played. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea on her garden bench, watching a sparrow pick nervously at crumbs near her shoes. She had barely touched her cup when a familiar figure appeared at her gate. It was Mrs. Fleet, or rather, what remained of her, no longer dressed in her usual stiff-pressed skirt and jacket, but instead in a faded wool coat, her hair loose and her expression frayed. "May I come in?" she asked. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Of course. She led her visitor inside, prepared a fresh pot of tea, and said nothing until the cups had been poured and the plates of lemon biscuits arranged. "I know what you think," Mrs. Fleet began. "Do you?" "That I forged the journal. That I planted the glove. That I—" She broke off, and for a moment her eyes gleamed. "That I murdered Lavinia." Miss Marple tilted her head. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are capable of many things. But what I wonder, Marjorie, is why?" Mrs. Fleet's mouth tightened. "Because she was going to ruin me." "Over the Jubilee funds? That was just the excuse," she snapped. "She'd been gathering things, notes, letters, she planned, to expose me at the next council meeting. Said I was siphoning donations, redirecting them into my husband's memorial account. A technicality, but enough to disgrace me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "So you took the glove, staged the scene, and planted the claws to frame Mr. Hargreaves." Mrs. Fleet nodded, slow and cold. He was convenient, secretive. Everyone already suspected him. It would have been easy. But then the girl, Annie, came too close. She saw him in the study that morning. That was useful. I thought the journal might give her just enough fright to leave quietly. Miss Marple took a sip of tea, and if she hadn't, Mrs. Fleet met her gaze. "I don't know. That, Miss Marple thought, was the truest thing she had said all morning. The confession, when it came later that evening to Inspector Crayford, was clear, composed, and complete. Mrs. Fleet admitted to entering the house after Miss Coombs had begun her letter. An early morning visit masked as a concern about rose mildew. She had seen the letter, read the final lines, and panicked. "I didn't mean to," she told Crayford. "I only meant to tear it up. But she wouldn't let me. She stood in front of the desk. I shoved her aside." The inspector looked up, and she hit her head on the radiator. "I didn't check. I didn't think." She trailed off. "You poured the ink," he said, "to make it look accidental." She nodded. "Where's the rest of the letter?" "I burned it. And the glove?" "I kept it. Then thought it better to let it be found." The village did not take the news well. Mrs. Fleet was not arrested that evening, not formally. She was escorted to the station. Chapter 9. The reveal: it was on a damp Tuesday morning that the entire village of Elmswood seemed to breathe out at once. The newspapers had printed the headlines with characteristic understatement. "Woman held in village inquiry," followed the next day by "Local trust scandal tied to sudden death." There were no pictures, of course. Elmswood was too small for that sort of spectacle. But the gossip pages in Tunbridge and Little Wetherby carried just enough detail to keep the neighbouring towns talking. But within Elmswood, the shock had begun to settle into a strange kind of discomfort. There was no triumph, no vindication, only quiet, hesitant conversations behind doors that no longer felt as tightly shut. And yet there was still one conversation left to be had. One that Miss Marple had been waiting for. She received the invitation 2 days later, in a delicate cream envelope bearing an unfamiliar hand. "Dear Miss Marple, might I request the favour of your company at the Limes, Thursday afternoon, 4 o'clock? I believe it is time to speak plainly. Julian Hargreaves." She arrived punctually, as always, wearing her pale blue cardigan and carrying a single rose from her garden, a habit she had kept for many years when visiting those in need of gentler truths. Julian Hargreaves met her at the door. He looked more worn than before, his silvering hair slightly unkempt and his collar rumpled. He offered her tea, which she declined, and led her into the drawing-room where the curtains had been pulled back for the first time in weeks. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "I suspected you might reach out. I'm told Mrs. Fleet confessed. Fully. She did." He stood for a moment, saying nothing, then moved to the mantel and stared down at the cold grate. "I wasn't entirely honest with you," he said at last. "Oh, I knew about the will. I knew she was drafting a change." Miss Marple tilted her head, but said nothing. "I discouraged it," he went on, "told her it was too hasty, too disruptive, that it would invite questions. But the truth is, I stood to lose from the change. Not the house, perhaps, but the reputation. My family name. There were clauses, references to my uncle's old dealings with Miss Harwood." Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting unmoved in her lap. "And so," he said bitterly, "I did what men like me always do. I preserved my standing. I lied. But you didn't kill her," Miss Marple said gently. He looked at her, startled. "No," she continued, "you didn't kill her. You may have manipulated. You may even have taken advantage of her trust. But you're not capable of violence, Mr. Hargreaves. You're capable of calculation, not chaos." He stared for a long moment, then slumped into the armchair opposite her. "Why are you here?" he asked. "To forgive me?" "No," Miss Marple said. "I'm here because the truth is owed, not just to the law, but to the living and to the dead." He blinked. "Mrs. Fleet framed you with remarkable care. She exploited your aloofness, your past, your silence. She hoped to trap you into her narrative. But the truth is, she didn't need to. You were already hiding." She paused. "And secrets, Mr. Hargreaves, are only useful when you know how to bury them. You, I think, have always preferred to entomb them in civility." He exhaled slowly. "Will I be charged?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, but I do suggest you make a donation to the Coombs Trust in Miss Lavinia's memory, and perhaps take a more active role in the village you now live in." He gave a weak chuckle. "You mean I should join the Ladies' Auxiliary?" It would be an excellent place to start. The final piece, of course, came later that week. At the Friday market, Miss Marple was browsing among the preserves when she encountered Annie. The girl looked brighter, lighter even, and wore a new blue ribbon in her hair. "I thought you might like this," Annie said, producing a small folded note. It was from Miss Coombs, dated 2 days before her death. "To whom it may concern, should anything happen to me, I leave this note as record of my intentions. I have decided to dissolve the committee's claim to the Jubilee Fund and place it instead under the stewardship of the Reverend Pritchard and Mrs. Ellison. I have written to Mr. Hargreaves to prepare the necessary papers. I believe this change will bring the peace and honesty Elmswood deserves. Lavinia Coombs, Miss Marple read it twice. Where did you find it? In the sewing tin. Bottom false layer. She must have suspected something." Miss Marple nodded. "She often did." The village gathered for a quiet memorial in Miss Coombs's honour the next Sunday. There were no speeches, no grand displays, only roses from her garden, placed in a basket beneath the chapel window, and a small plaque installed near the bird bath she had so loved. It read simply, "In memory of Lavinia Coombs, who saw clearly." Afterward, Miss Marple lingered at the edge of the lawn, watching the others drift away. The mystery was over. The lines had been drawn, the players revealed, but the story, as always, lived on in whispers and glances, in quiet truths and unspoken reckonings. Annie came to stand beside her. "She would have liked this," she said, softly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "she would have." They stood for a while, listening to the hush of the trees. Then Miss Marple said, "Human nature, Annie, is a curious thing. It hides in plain sight. But give it time, a little space, and the truth always grows through the cracks." She smiled. "Unfortunately," she added, "I've always been a gardener." Chapter 10. Aftermath summer lingered longer than expected in Elmswood that year, as though the season, like the village itself, was reluctant to let go of what had come before. The roses in Miss Coombs's garden, untamed now but still proud, bloomed one last time before the cool winds of September set in. With each passing day, the events surrounding her death slipped further into the village's soft haze of collective memory. But for those closest to the affair, The aftermath was not so easily escaped. Julian Hargreaves, despite his cleared name, did not remain in Elmswood. After a final, formal donation to the Coombs Trust and a letter of apology to Annie, handwritten, no longer typed, he left the Limes to a distant cousin and returned to London. Miss Marple suspected he would find his way back to a quieter life in chambers and contracts, but perhaps with a better understanding of the fragility of respectability. Annie Fowler remained in the village. The scandal that had nearly swept her away gave way to quiet respect once the truth emerged. With Miss Marple's gentle encouragement and the Reverend Pritchard's help, she was offered a position at the newly restructured village library. She took it gladly, and it was there, in the hush between borrowed novels and the sorting of old parish records, that she found her peace. Mrs. Fleet, now a name spoken only in low tones and loaded glances, had been moved to a correctional facility on the outskirts of Kent. Her trial was short, her sentence lenient for reasons of age and character. But her place in the village was gone, as irrevocably as Miss Coombs herself. The village bulletin, once tightly monitored by her pen, now circulated without her corrections, and somehow life continued, and Miss Marple. She returned to her garden, to her reading circles and her lemon drizzle cakes, and to the comforting, unspoken agreement that her insight would be called upon only when truly necessary. She never boasted. She never explained more than was needed. But in the weeks that followed, several villagers, Mrs. Lyle, the grocer's wife, even Colonel Ashcroft, stopped by her cottage under one pretence or another, lingering just long enough to say, "You knew, didn't you?" To which Miss Marple always replied with the softest of smiles and a gentle shrug. "Oh, I wouldn't say knew, not until the very end." It was on an especially golden afternoon that Miss Marple sat in her parlour, knitting in hand, when the Reverend Pritchard arrived with a parcel. "A small token," he said, "from the parish council, in gratitude." She opened it to find a single leather-bound book, engraved with her initials in gold. Inside was a handwritten note from Annie. "To Miss Marple, who taught me that truth doesn't always shout. It sometimes whispers with all. My thanks, Annie." Miss Marple closed the book gently. "Very thoughtful," she said. The vicar smiled. "There's talk of naming the new rose beds after her, you know." "Lavinia would have liked that," Miss Marple replied, "though she would have insisted on approving the fertilizer." They both laughed softly. Later that evening, after supper, Miss Marple sat beside her bedroom window, watching the shadows lengthen across the village rooftops. The streets were quiet. The lights came on one by one. Life, in all its ordinary rhythms, continued. She thought of the ink-stained glove, the fountain pen by the bird bath, the panic in Mr. Hargreaves's eyes, the false clues, the planted journal, the desperation that had clung like fog around Mrs. Fleet. Most of all, she thought of Lavinia Coombs, sharp, private, uncompromising, and determined to put her affairs in order right to the end, I suppose, Miss Marple murmured to herself. That truth always has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. The candle flickered beside her as she picked up her knitting once more. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, a church bell struck 7, and somewhere, in the quiet hush of a village that never quite forgot, Its secrets, a garden bloomed again, wild, beautiful, and finally free.